Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and I'd like to turn our time over to Chai.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. Good morning. As Peter said, my name is Chai Jindasurat. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Vice President of Policy at Nonprofit New York. We're an association of nonprofits in the New York City area, primarily in New York City, but we also have members in Westchester and Long Island. And we have around 1,700 member organizations, and I do the policy work, although we have a lot of other programs and services for our members. And one of the things that we've done a lot over the past year is federal advocacy, and in particular, really advocating with the congressional delegation to make sure that nonprofits were included in federal relief, starting back at the beginning of 2020 with the Families First Act and then the CARES Act. And then, of course, we know there wasn't much activity until the new Congress and the new administration with the American Rescue Plan. But I'll just provide a really high level overview of some of the nonprofit specific provisions of that. I'm probably not as in the weeds, or I don't have as much expertise on specific program areas for nonprofits. It's really Nonprofit New York, because our membership includes all nonprofits. We don't really do as much advocacy specifically on a particular sector, like we're monitoring what's happening with the Shuttered Venues Operating Grant for the arts organizations, but we're not as involved in that. And same thing with SNAP. Like, we know that a lot of our members are doing a lot of advocacy around SNAP, but that's not something that I have as much expertise on. It's more around, like, what are the business relief efforts that all nonprofits can take a part of. And so I want to I want to thank and shout out our national partners at the National Council of Nonprofits. They are the umbrella for all of us. So there are associations of nonprofits across the country, and most of us are members of the National Council, and they put together this really helpful kind of breakdown of how nonprofits are included in the American Rescue Plan. And so I'll just say that we got a lot of wins in the American Rescue Plan. There were many outstanding recommendations that we had as the nonprofit sector following CARES, and did a lot of, high profile advocacy efforts with all of you and with the sector to try and communicate and work with the congressional delegation, everybody from Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, who is chair of Small Business Services, to, of course, Senator Schumer, who advocated really, really hard. And so I want to thank him and all of our delegation for really partnering with nonprofits to make sure that, honestly, we could survive COVID, because at the beginning, so much of our funding was uncertain. We just really weren't sure what was going to happen. And so the biggest win, I would say, is that under the PPP program, which I think everyone is now familiar with because it's just such a well-used, well-known program. Before the American Rescue Plan, there was a cap on how many employees an organization could have to be eligible for PPP. And so we kept advocating that a lot of nonprofits in New York, and in particular New York City, who provide essential services, have more than 500 staff, and that was one of the caps. So that was lifted. The only caveat to that is that nonprofits with more than 500 staff just cannot have 500 employees at a single location. That's not limited to a city. So it doesn't mean that you can't have more than 500 staff within New York City. It just means, like, at this facility or this program, you have 500 or less. One note is that the PPP loan program, there was another bill that extended the deadline through May 31st, I believe. However, we've heard that the funding is running low, and so we're not sure if the funding will actually last through that deadline. So if you haven't applied yet, please apply. And you can also apply for a second draw. And so there's information about both of those in that breakdown. And then I'm also going to share our referral, our partners at BDO FMA, which is the Fiscal Management Associates. They do a lot of really excellent technical assistance work for nonprofits on things like applying for PPP, answering some of those technical questions. They had a toolkit. And then some of these other areas that I'll talk about as well are additional revenue sources for nonprofits that are less well known. And FMA similarly is a great technical assistance provider. So they're always our go-to, and I recommend reaching out to them if you're interested. If you need some legal counsel, there's also NILP and Lawyers Alliance. Those are some of our main partners that we support and partner with on these. So then, additionally, the idle loan, there was additional money added, so $15 billion for that. And the shuttered venue operators grant, which I mentioned. This is primarily benefiting our arts and cultural nonprofits. There were some technical glitches with the rollout, but as of this past weekend, I think it's now back up and running. And I'm not sure if any of you are interested or even looking into that, but I know that one of the things we were also monitoring, and that our cultural partners were even more, was that originally there was a restriction on whether or not you could get PPP or the SVO grant. And so I think now they have sorted that out, but it's just something to consider as well. Like there's pros and cons of either. Okay, so another one that I think a lot of nonprofits in New York were dealing with was that in 2020, because of the funding uncertainty, because of the fiscal situation of the state, and many other conditions related to the economic downturn and COVID, organizations had to furlough and lay off staff, and many staff had to go on unemployment. And so for nonprofits that self-insured, that meant that at the state level, they were responsible for covering the costs of their employees who went on unemployment. And this was a very unexpected expense. So prior to something like a major economic downturn, a lot of organizations that didn't have a lot of turnover chose to self-insure because it was actually the more prudent option for them. And so one of the things that happened through CARES in the spring of 2020 was the federal government, Congress passed a 50% reimbursement for organizations that self-insured. So even though they would have to pay the Department of Labor at the state level 50%, even though they would have to pay for those staff that went on unemployment from their organizations, CARES reimbursed that by 50%. One of our kind of longstanding advocacy asks all year last year was to bump that up to 100%. Congress, through the American Rescue Plan, actually bumped it up to 75%. But it's not as relevant for New York, fortunately, because New York, at the beginning, I think it was either in January or in December, I think it was January, they came out with a rule that they would reimburse 100%, which was huge. And so it's not as significant for nonprofits in New York because we are now able to be reimbursed 100%, but it is a really big win for our partners across the country. So just a couple of additional highlights that I think a lot of nonprofits should be aware of are that the employee retention tax credit and then paid leave tax credits for employers are additional reimbursement methods that organizations may not be aware of. So I've heard a lot from our partners at FMA that when they're working with nonprofits, many of them don't know that they can apply for the employee retention tax credit, which is a really great source of revenue if you haven't looked into it. Typically, before this, the way that tax credits were structured for businesses, and nonprofits are businesses, was that the tax credit would be applied to the corporate income tax that a business would have to pay. And of course, nonprofits don't pay corporate income taxes, but we do pay employee payroll taxes. And so this can be applied to employee payroll taxes so that nonprofits can be included structurally as well. And then there are some additional things in here that are listed related to the individual and family tax credits. But I would just say that the really, really big win for us is that, last year, the fiscal outlook for the city and for the state was really uncertain. We were looking at a $14 billion deficit. And so our advocacy included a lot of calls to fund state and local governments. And the American Rescue Plan did do that. So it provided $350 billion in aid. There are some very kind of specific areas where this funding can go. But I think that that made a really, really big difference in the budget, the state budget that came out this year, and also the budget that was released by the city just yesterday. That looks much better than many of us expected. And so I think nonprofits, who contract with the state and with the city, were really relieved to see that. And then the National Council also has some additional